We're now producing and consuming messages from a shared topic in our first cluster. We actually have a second cluster in our training department called Train2. And we'd like to geo-rep this data that's inside of the geo-rep namespace, shared topic, over to that cluster. From cluster A to cluster B, we already have cluster B's credentials inside of cluster A, and we've given your tenant permissions to use those credentials. All we need to do now is turn on geo-replication at the namespace level. And then all topics within that namespace will automatically be replicated over to the second cluster. So here in the shared topic project, I have a file called enable georep. This uses the Java admin client, so it's slightly different than the Java Pulsar client, which is used to produce and consume messages. This is for administration tasks. The Pulsar admin URL, issuer URL, and audience are already pre-populated for you. We're logging into that first cluster, your cluster that you've been working with this whole time called train. But your credentials URL, we're going to need to edit this so it points to your file that you've placed in the resources folder. And we're going to call that student3. That's my student name. You'll update it to your student name. If we scroll down, you'll see that the command that we're running, and actually we need to update this namespace as well. So the tenant and namespace should be your tenant for your student ID and then the georep namespace. We're making a list of clusters, so train and train2. So you always keep your existing cluster that you're in, which is train, and add a second cluster. You can actually add multiples if you'd like. But we're going to be running a command called Pulsar admin at the namespaces level, set namespace replication clusters. So actually, again, there's 3 commands that it takes to turn on georep. One, we need to have the credentials to the second server inside of our first server. I've done that for you. I've given your tenant permissions to use those credentials. And now we need to finally, as the third step, turn on replication at the namespace level. There's a few things that need to be set up on the second server side. That tenant and namespace need to already exist, and then the topics need to exist with the same partition versus non-partition, as well as the number of partition settings as on your source. So your shared topic should have been automatically created, and on this particular server, it will get created as a partition topic with 1 partition. So that's what I've created for you already on that second server inside of your tenant and namespace. Let's go ahead and execute this to turn on geo-replication. I'm not going to go into too much troubleshooting. If you don't get it to work, I'm more than happy if you reach out to training and I'll take a look and I can explain exactly what happened if it doesn't seem to be working. But we're going to test it simply by turning it on. So first let me get terminal up. And then I'm going to point a Pulsar consumer to that second cluster. And you're more than welcome to also try and point a Kafka consumer. This works well with shared topics if they use, again, the string or byte type of message. For all types of messages, this works with Pulsar only topics. But it looks like it returned Pulsar admin. I don't have a system.out here after it actually does that, so it just exits. And to test it, I'm going to go to my Pulsar consumer cluster B. Here in Pulsar Consumer Cluster B, I need to once again edit my config file location for my OAuth into that cluster. That cluster is called Train2, so that's your audience. You need the service URL. I'm actually going to leave this out for you in the class. I'll put it in the comments after the video, so you can go ahead and grab that. If we look at one of the other producers, the service URL for Pulsar, when it's secure, starts with Pulsar plus SSL and ends in port 6651. This, of course, is for the first cluster. The URL for the second cluster I'll put in after the video, but I'm going to paste it in here for you as well. So this is to the second cluster. And then the topic that you're reading from, you'll need to edit this to say your Kafka student ID, georep shared topic. It's always a good idea to not use the same subscription name on both clusters, Cluster A and Cluster B. For this, I've used Pulsar Consumer Cluster B. That's just in case you start using what's called replicated subscriptions, which allows the failover of producers and consumers from one cluster to the other, where we actually replicate the cursor data. That's good for situations where your second cluster is designed in case the first cluster goes down, those producers and consumers can pick up where it left off just by pointing to the second cluster. So because this is a completely different consumer unrelated to that one on the first cluster. Even though we're not using replicated subscription, I'm going to use a different subscription name. And then I'm going to consume messages. So let me go ahead and start up the Pulsar Consumer Cluster B Java. Once that's started up, by default, it may not pick up any existing messages. It actually only picks up new messages. That's the default behavior. Let me go ahead and create a new terminal. So I'm going to keep this one running. Let me create a new terminal window. Move into KSN training. We're going to go ahead and do Pulsar producer first. Let me produce on the first server. So here we've produced a message with Pulsar called published by Pulsar producer on the first server. If I go over to the second server, we can see here published by Pulsar producer, consumed by Pulsar consumer. And again, this is consuming from the second server. So this message has gone through Geo-Rep over to the second server. If you don't see this, there are a ton of ways we can troubleshoot this. I don't want to necessarily go through that in this class. There's ways we can check if the subscription or if the replicator has been turned on. That's an admin task. I'd also probably go in and take a look at some of the logs for the brokers to see what's going on. But typically, once you have some of this set up with the credentials side, it's pretty easy to turn it on at the tenant and namespace level, and this is what you should see. But again, feel free to reach out to training, and I can help troubleshoot this if you didn't get Geo-Rep up and running. You are now welcome to play around with a bit more. For instance, let's do a Kafka producer here on our first cluster and see if it also gets sent over to the second server and consumed by the Pulsar consumer on the second server. So here we're going to produce that Kafka message. So here's a string message produced by Kafka. And if I go over to my other Java file here, it says published by Kafka producer, consumed by Pulsar consumer. And in fact, what I should do is change this to say consumed by Pulsar consumer on cluster B to make it a little more obvious. You can add that to your code as well. But yeah, you're welcome to test that. Again, this works well with when you're sharing topics between Kafka and Pulsar with string and byte messages.